Okay, so I am going to officially announce our speaker and kick off today's lecture. So hi everyone, my name is Sophie Block. I'm the director of Hillels of Memphis, and I'm so excited that you're joining us today for the On One Foot Jewish lecture series. So On One Foot is a virtual learning series that features different Jewish faculty from our local universities every other week to spotlight the incredible academic and intellectual Jewish talent we have here in Memphis for everyone in the community to enjoy. This week's lecturer is Professor Dan Unowsky, who many of you know. He's the chair of the history department at the University of Memphis. He has a PhD in history from Columbia University, and his fields of interest are modern Central and Eastern European history, nationalism, anti-Semitism, and European monarchy. So with that, I will officially pass the mic over to Professor Unowsky.
All right, well, thank you. And thanks for joining on this cold day. I hope you're all comfortable in your warm homes. If you're coming on, go ahead and mute yourselves. I think I can, I don't think I can mute everybody. So if you could mute yourself so that your volume doesn't interfere, and I'm going to share the screen. I was originally thinking we'd be all sitting around a table in my mind, and of course this is a Zoom event, and so my preparation became much more formal over time, and so it is more of a formal lecture presentation. So I hope it'll still be interesting for you, and hopefully we'll have some time to ask questions as well. So 1 second here. I just want to make sure I have everything set up right. And then I'll share my screen, just a moment. Okay. Okay. So I am just going to say a few words about Jews and Judaism, really in post-war Poland. And I just want to start with these two images. I hope everybody can see that and be able to follow along with me. So there are really two stark images that I think really set up the contradictions of Polish history in the 20th century and beyond until today. The upper left, not just Polish history, I should say, but the image of Jews and Judaism in Polish society over time. So the upper left is a commemoration, one of the most moving such commemorations I have ever seen, which was first done in 2019. And it's a projection, if you see that, of the Great Synagogue of Warsaw, which had been built in 1878 and was blown up in April of 1943, and on the 75th, ending the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and on the 75th anniversary of that, it was projected on a skyscraper which stands on the same spot that synagogue had once stood. And it was a powerful commemoration. The sound that went along with the image was the singing of the great cantor from the 1920s who sang in that synagogue. It was a very moving and very public celebration and remembrance of the Jews as part of the Polish past. And then if you look at the bottom right, I'm trying to use my cursor to sort of show you where I'm looking. This is really a horrific moment in 2015 at the height of the immigration crisis in Europe. Right wing in Poland, afraid of foreigners, protested immigration. And how did they protest immigration? I don't know if you can see it well enough, but this figure that's being burned here in effigy is a stereotypical Orthodox Jew dressed in the long coat, had payas and a beard and so on. This is supposedly a protest against the fear of immigration. And who do they burn? They burn the image of the Jew, right? So it's a very stark difference of how Poles in Poland today think about the Jews. On the one hand, embracing the idea of the absent Jews as something missing from society, something to remember in a sort of positive collective way, if we can say it that way. And on the other hand, Jews as the symbol of everything that's anti-Polish and threatening, right? So that history of how that comes about is sort of part of what I want to talk about today. And like all historians, we have to go way back into the past. So you'll have to bear with me for a moment. And on the upper left is a map of Poland, Lithuania in the 18th, well, I guess the map is really from the 1700s. Poland, Lithuania was a huge state, and you can see sort of color projected over the current map of Europe. And you can see it included much of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, part, but not all of today's Poland. It was a huge country, and it was divided and disappeared in the late 18th century altogether. So from the 1790s until 1918, there was no Poland. But when there had been Poland, Lithuania, as many of you know, I'm sure, the vast majority really of Jews of the world lived in this area, Poland, Lithuania, when it was divided. So this was really the home and the heart of the Jewish people in the early modern period. And then of course, the Jewish people became divided here in these three states by the 1790s. When Poland is reborn in 1918, it's actually reborn. I'll show you another slide later so you can see it more clearly, but it's reborn in different borders. It no longer included much of the eastern provinces that were now part of the Soviet Union. And one of the great questions inside the new Poland in 1918 was how to think about the current new state of Poland and its relationship to the Polish-Lithuanian past that had ended so long ago. Was it a continuation of that after a long absence? Was it something new? Who is really a Pole? What is Poland supposed to be? And this question was really a dynamic and central question of Polish history in the 20th century. And these two figures, these two really giant politicians of Poland in the interwar period, represent two very different images of Poland and what Polishness should be. And they kind of parallel those two images I showed at the beginning. On the one hand is Józef Pilsudski, you've probably heard of him, who had his origins in the left, became the great Polish military figure in World War I and its rebirth of Poland in 1918. And he wanted as large a Poland as possible. He wanted to connect the new Poland of 1918 with the old Poland, Lithuania before the 1790s. He wanted Poland to be a federation, an umbrella under which many different peoples, including Jews and Belarusians and Ukrainians and Germans, would all live in sort of some kind of harmony. Yeah. This man to the right, Roman Dmowski, however, his great rival, the head of the National Democratic Party, he wanted the new Poland of 1918 not to be like the old Poland in the 18th century, but to be a Poland for the Poles, a Poland for ethnic Poles, for Poles of the blood, for Catholic Polish-speaking people only. And there was a great tension between these two men and these two political movements, really, that they headed in interwar Poland that's very powerfully important for the whole history of Poland and Jews in Poland in the 20th century. So just to remind people a little bit, I'm sure you're familiar that in interwar Poland was on the one hand a place that was difficult for Jews, the rising anti-Semitism of the Dmowski's movement, which led to quotas on Jews in universities and restrictions on Jewish life, especially after the death of Pilsudski in 1935. But it was also, in many ways, a great flowering of modern Jewish culture and politics in interwar Poland. The Jews in interwar Poland were members of all kinds of different religious streams, from Hasidism to progressive liberal versions of Judaism. Many Jews were adherents of different forms of Zionism, sort of moderate Zionism, right-wing ethnic style Zionism, socialist versions of Zionism. Of course, the Bundist movement, a socialist movement that was not Zionist, but was very much promoting specifically Jewish identity in the diaspora. Bundism, many of you have heard of, and many Jews became members of the regular, let's say non-Jewish anyway, Polish socialist movement. So it was a very complicated and rich, active Jewish community in the interwar period, as you all know. And all of that comes to an end in 1939 when Poland disappears again. So Lithuania exists until the 1790s. The smaller version of Poland was reborn in 1918, and in 1939, Poland disappears again. With the eastern part now annexed to the Soviet Union, the western regions annexed to Nazi Germany, and this sort of central area, the government general of Poland, occupied by Germany, but not annexed to Germany. Again, this is a story many of you probably already know, but I'm just saying a little bit about it now. And of course, the death camps, the death camps, the great ghettos also of Warsaw and Łódź, but the 6 death camps, Treblinka, Chełmno, Auschwitz, Majdanek, Belzec, and Sobibor, are all, as you see here, constructed by the Nazis on the territory of what had been interwar Poland. They're not built there because of the Poles. They're constructed there because this is where the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe live. Something I maybe should have mentioned, in the interwar period, there are about 3,300,000 Jews, about 10% of the population of interwar Poland are Jews. And so these death camps are built near the centers of Jewish life. Again, you know this story, which but one of the dramatic moments certainly is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, which ends with the almost complete destruction of the center of Warsaw. You can see it here, complete flattening of the center, which had been the ghetto, right? The ghetto in 1940 to 1943. Good. After 1945, Poland is reborn again. Again, it disappears in 1790s. It's reborn in 1918 in different borders. You can see that here. Here are the 1790s borders, right? It's reborn here in 1918, disappears in 1939 again, and now it's born in this pink area post-1945. So Poland's become smaller and moved west. And all these eastern territories, right, where people who spoke Ukrainian and Belarusian and Lithuanian, where much of the Jewish population before the destruction of the Holocaust had lived, all the sort of what you could think of as multicultural Poland is gone. And what's left is this core now in which the vast majority of people, really for the first time in Polish history, are almost all Catholic Polish speakers. Right after the war ends, many of you know this, a few tens of thousands of Jews who'd survived in hiding try to return, many of them to their homes. About 150,000 Jews who had survived in the Soviet Union also returned to Poland. Many of them soon flee. Why? There's a series, you've heard of these, I'm sure, the series of anti-Jewish attacks. About 300 Jews were killed in these from 1944 to 1946. The most famous was in Kielce in 1946, but there's also one in Krakow that's very well known, for example. So many of these, let's say there were 250,000 Jews in Poland or so after 1945. Many leave almost immediately after this violence. Something else I should note, among the top leaders of the communist government, that takes over in the 1940s, backed by the Soviet Union, were people of Jewish descent, Jews and people of Jewish descent, most infamously the head of the Ministry of Public Security, Yaakov Berman. right? So this is also important to keep in mind. So the Jewish survivors try to get to their homes. Many of them are attacked. Many Jews flee. Among the small numbers of Jews who stay are some very prominent members now of the Polish Communist Party. In the 1950s, I don't know if I can move that out of the way. Yeah, in the 1950s, after the death of Stalin, there's an effort to throw out the legacy of Stalin. People are released from prisons. This happens all over Eastern Europe. But something that happens is slightly different in Poland is Stalinism in Poland itself is blamed by non-Jewish communists on the Jewish communist leaders. So when Poland becomes de-Stalinized, all of that is blamed conveniently on the Jews collectively, the crimes of Stalin. Many Jews leave, as you might imagine, of the small numbers. Almost all the rest of the Jews of Poland who are alive leave after 1968, when after the 1967 victory in the 7 Days War, there is an anti-Zionist campaign in Poland. You can see here these factory workers with their signs, not spontaneously created, of course. Here's one: Zionists go to Israel, for example. So after 1968, almost all the Jews are gone from Poland. There's a tiny number of Jews. And Jewish life is largely limited to, I'm just trying to fix my image on my screen, just a moment. Yeah, are limited to remnants. Yeah, remnants of Jewish life. If you traveled in Poland in the 1970s, the 1980s, you wouldn't have met many Jews anywhere. You wouldn't have found functioning synagogues or Jewish community centers, any of the marks we think of when we think of Jewish communal life. You would have found sad remnants, as you see here, of synagogues. You would have found synagogues that had been repurposed, like this one in Poznan, which was turned into a public swimming pool, for example. One of the only working synagogues was the Ramuch synagogue in Krakow, which had a few dozen elderly members who would meet on some Saturdays. So that really looks in a way like the end of Jewish life, right, in Poland. And yet after 1989, there has really been a really flowering, an outpouring of Jews and Judaism very visible in public life in Poland, which seems hard to believe when the numbers are so small. I don't know if you can see this on my screen. I had my images in front of that. Okay, so if you look to this demography, about 3.25, 3.3 million Jews lived in Poland in 1939. About 100,000 counted in 1945, 230,000 in 1946. This is mostly the influx of Jews who had survived in the Soviet Union coming back. As you see, after Kielce, almost, most of the Jews leave. Then the anti-Stalinist program, blaming that on the Jews, most of the rest leave. Then the 1968 anti-Zionist campaign leaves hardly any Jews left in Poland. I've seen different numbers. Sometimes people used to say in 1989 there were about 1,000 Jews who were actually members in some way publicly committed to the Jewish community. This particular set of data suggests there's about 3,000 Jews in Poland in 2000 out of a population. I think the Polish population was 40 million, something like that. And yet, with such a small number of Jews, Jews have become, since 1989, a very visible part of life, or Judaism, let's say, of public life in Poland. Most famously, this Polish Cultural Festival, which already started before the end of communism in 1988, takes place in Krakow every June and is the largest Jewish cultural festival in Europe. Tens of thousands of people come. This is just a picture here you can see in the Szeroka Square in Kazimierz, which is a a kind of part of Krakow associated with centuries of Jewish life. And you can see thousands of people listening to a klezmer concert. Yeah, and this is, you see this every year in Poland, in Krakow. That section of Krakow, Kazimierz, which is one of the few places in Europe, Eastern Europe anyway, that the Nazis left a sort of infrastructure, visible infrastructure of synagogues and Jewish communal buildings, even though they were mostly in semi-ruin. This area of Kazimierz has been increasingly renovated. You go there today, people go there and they see the synagogues, the Jewish restaurants or Jewish style restaurants. One of the most visible examples of this visibility of Jewish life is at the center of Warsaw. If you remember that picture I showed of the flattened area, right, of after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, in the middle of that in 2013 was constructed this really amazing museum. So if anybody ever goes to Warsaw, this is really where you have to go. Polin, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, opened in 2013, again, right on the center of the ghetto. The museum was dedicated to this centuries-long history of Jewish life, not just to the Holocaust, right? That's, of course, part of the exhibition of the museum, but it's mostly about the many centuries of the Jewish presence in the Polish lands. A striking feature of this museum is the centerpiece of its permanent exhibition, which is a ceiling, a reconstructed ceiling from a 17th century synagogue, a synagogue which no longer exists. There were some photographs of the synagogue that still remain, taken in the 19th century. And as part of the construction of this museum, really an amazing project, all over Poland, artists held workshops and invited children and whoever was interested to come and help paint parts of this reconstructed ceiling. And then all the parts were brought to Warsaw. And if you go, I don't know if you can see this image well, but it's really very stunning. It's not quite as large as the original was, but it's really an amazing reconstruction of the central room of this wooden synagogue from the 1600s at the center of this museum. Maybe slightly less triumphant about this revival of Jewish visibility is this Jewish tourism, not necessarily having anything to do with Jews, right? There are only very small numbers of Jews, but you can, if you go to Krakow, you can book tours, of course, of Krakow, where you can ride out to Auschwitz, stopping for lunch. You know, the whole thing, it's a bit of a difficult scenario to imagine this level of tourism, right, attached with the remnants of the Jewish presence. And of course, for sale everywhere, these wooden dolls, right? There's a long tradition of it. It's less specifically anti-Semitic than you might imagine, although it still looks pretty bad, right? This the sad Jewish dolls that you can purchase everywhere is part of this revival of Jewish visibility. But what about Jewish life in Poland today? What's the possibility when the numbers are so tiny, right? And yet there is certainly a Jewish revival in Poland, which is very striking. Here's just some examples from Krakow: the renovation of the synagogues, the building of a new and really very nice Jewish community center, for example. There are liberal and Orthodox Jewish congregations in Krakow and in Warsaw as well. If you went to Warsaw until maybe the last 10 years, about the only visible presence of the Jewish past would be in the really fantastic Warsaw Jewish Cemetery, which again, if you go to Warsaw, it's certainly one of the places you should go. But there's also been a revival of Jewish life outside the cemetery. The last of the Orthodox synagogues, as you can see, holds very, every Shabbat holds services. There are also two liberal congregations now in Warsaw and an active Jewish community center. Who are these Jews, though, right? Or who goes there when there's almost no Jews, as I said? Well, one interesting phenomenon in the last 10 or 15 years, in part inspired maybe by this public visibility of the Jewish past being revived everywhere so visibly, has been a phenomenon where young people have been finding, hundreds, thousands of young people have discovered that one or more relative, grandma, grandpa, was Jewish and had simply hidden that and not told the family. And there's this phenomena of thousands of Jewish people, thousands of young people, in a way reclaiming this Jewish heritage, and then joining these Jewish institutions that I just showed you some pictures of. So let me just show you a trailer of a recent film. I think it's 5 years old, called The Return, and I hope you can hear it. Can you?
I was raised up Catholic, and when I found out we have Jewish roots, I thought like I'm the only person in Poland that experiences this, and I felt a bit lonely.
Trying to be Jewish in Warsaw is rather difficult because the community is small, because we don't have so many Jewish facilities. It's very difficult to pursue Jewish life in Poland.
Once you decide to be Jew in Poland, it's your full-time responsibility. I think once you take on an identity of a minority, that kind of takes over your life a little bit.
This huge amount of connection to Jewish world and without many Jews around was very strange to me. I remember when I first came here and they were like, oh, who's your favorite klezmer band? And for me, klezmer is like Fiddler on the Roof. Like I'm not, or oh, what Jewish music do you like? And I'm like, I don't know, Beastie Boys. Like what is Jewish music?
And now you are living as a parasite. Ain't it easy living as a parasite?
Here in Europe, it's very cool to have three types of friends: Jewish one, black one, and a homosexual one. And if you have them, like, oh yeah, you're cool.
For sure, being a Jew sometimes is cool, but the exotic is when you say, yeah, my roots are Jewish. But when that starts to be a really religion, it's not so cool anymore. That's why I would love to go to Israel sometime and not to be the only one.
Most of us have to learn Judaism from the very beginning, in adolescence or even being an adult. It's very exciting. We feel like pioneers, when I think at the beginning of Israel, it's still this problem of Jewish coming out, let's say.
It's important to know the history, but if you're showed just death camp, that makes no sense. Because the Holocaust, it's not the only part of the Jewish history.
My focus is on what it means to be a Jew in Poland, a place where there is a sort of gap, 50-year gap in Jewish identity.
The most difficult thing for me is the issue of identity. And it's really heavy on my heart because I don't know what to do with this.
So in terms of this revival, there's really a huge number of organizations inside Poland now for anyone who has been finding their Jewish roots. The Yiddish theater still exists. There are cultural organizations, religious organizations. Many of them have ties to sort of international foundations that help them with funding, like most importantly for Poland really has been the Lauder Foundation and the Taube Foundation and the Joint Distribution Committee, but there are also others, and they have helped to support these Jewish community centers, to fix up buildings, to revive cemeteries, and so on. But one thing to note, how many Jews are there? How many of these people have come and sort of reclaimed some roots of their past? Nobody really knows. I think today maybe there are about 10,000 people who are formally members of Jewish communities, and estimates range anywhere from 20 to 100,000 people with Jewish roots, many of whom have become increasingly interested in those roots and started to affiliate or associate with this revival of Jewish culture. In terms of Polish public life and the place of Jews in it, if you go back again to those two starking images I started out with, politics in Poland is so divided, and that divide really parallels that those stark images and those political, ideological differences about what Poland is and what Polishness is that I suggested when I showed those images of those interwar figures, Józef Pilsudski and Roman Dmowski. If you look at Polish politics today, it's almost like American politics in terms of divided almost 50-50. And right now, the leading political party is called the Law and Justice Party, or PIS, the initials, the Polish initials, PIS. And this is a party of the right that has become increasingly Catholic and nationalist, and increasingly positive about the idea of an ethnic Polish identity, that Poland should reflect this interest of this merger of Catholicism and Polish ethnic identity. On the other side is also still kind of a conservative party, a civic platform, which in the last election in 2020, President who was reelected, Andrzej Duda, won by just I think 1.5% over the mayor of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski. And Rafał Trzaskowski said some very shocking things for Poland. He said LGBTQ people are human too and deserve full rights and equality, and we should embrace our multicultural Polish past. Right, so this political divide is a very stark one in Poland. On the one hand, the government, increasingly nationalist Catholic, and while the leading government figures like the two men I have pictured here, they themselves don't speak out such things we would think of as openly anti-Semitic, but they give interviews and they have close relationships with institutions like Radio Maria, which is run by radically anti-Semitic priests inside the Polish Catholic Church, for example. One element of how all of this question of Jews and Judaism, but also these two visions of Poland plays out in public is about history. In the United States, I think if I talked about this long before, you'd be wondering who cares so much about history? Why is that such a why is that so important immediately in public debate? But of course, in our country, with the recent debates about monuments and how to deal with the Civil War and post-Civil War past, I think that maybe it seems like less of a mystery why history would seem so important to present day issues. In Poland, one of the issues that is constantly in the news, really, is this question of Polish action during the Holocaust. Since 2000, there have been a number of books, first by the American scholar Jan Gross, but then by some Polish scholars, Anna Bikont and others, as well as films like Ida, maybe some of you have seen that, that talk about not just the Polish underground army as having been heroic fighting against the Nazis, but also that many individual Poles turned in Jews to the Nazis or were involved in killing Jews in pogroms in 1941 in this period of chaos under occupation. There's been a strong reaction to that, a public reaction, where the government has actually instituted new laws saying that no one can say the Polish nation as a whole committed anti-Jewish acts in the past. But the line between saying an individual did something and saying somehow the whole Polish nation did something is blurred, and there have been court cases about this question. In fact, there's the most recent one happened just a couple weeks ago when Polish Jewish scholar Jan Grabowski and a Polish scholar Barbara Engelking, who edited this huge, almost 2,000-page work that looked at several counties in Poland in the 1943, 44 to see, to the degree they could, what happened to Jews who fled the death camps or fled the ghettos and hid in villages and farmhouses and so on. And what they found is that many of those Jews were turned in by Poles, not necessarily the ones who were trying to keep them in their basements or wherever, but by neighbors and so on, betrayed by their fellow Polish citizens. And this has become a huge issue in Polish public life. And these authors were just sued in a Polish court. And the result was that they are supposed to give an apology. There's a specific historical detail that this is about, which maybe is too much for us to talk about now, but to imagine that a historian is going to be brought up in court and the court is going to decide whether that historian has used documents from the 1940s or survivor testimony from the 1990s correctly, that's a court decision, is something rather, I think, odd and striking for most of us. Good. Why is there so much prominence about Jews and Judaism in Poland when the numbers are so small? There's all kinds of reasons for that. I mean, we can go back to the popular film Schindler's List, or the sort of capitalism of marketing Jewish heritage, the investment by foreign Jewish institutions in reviving Jewish life. For Poles, there's also been this interest in the pre-communist Polish past, recapturing some image of the past before communism, before Nazism, before the Nazi occupation, before communism. But there wasn't much time there. There's only 1919 to 39, and before that, 100 years with no Poland. So how do you go back to the past? What kind of image of Poland do you want to embrace? And there is this battle really over what Poland should be, what its connection to the Polish past is. And Jews and Judaism really are the front lines of that inner Polish discussion, right? Is Poland, should it be in the self-understanding, should it be a long history of some kind of, even though it's a romanticized version of things, it's not really necessarily the historical truth of it, but a version of Poland as a past that was multicultural, multi-religious, that saw a positive indifference? Or should it be a Poland that is narrowly Catholic and ethnic, xenophobic, looks at people who are not Catholic as suspicious, whether they're from the Muslim world, whether they're Jews, whoever they might be? What is Poland and who are Poles supposed to be? This remains a huge question in Poland, and Jews and Judaism are inextricable from the debates inside Poland on this question. For the Jews themselves of Poland, I don't know where things will go in the future, but there's still some of this post-1989 energy toward revival. Here's just some images of some a Jewish school based in Warsaw, and you can see there's quite a few children. The school has several hundred people who go to it. Some are Jews by Jewish law. Some are people who have reclaimed some part of their Jewish past. And that's where things stand today. Anyway, that's all I wanted to talk about. And so let me try to unshare my screen if I can figure out how to do it. Okay. So anyway, if anybody has any questions of that long overview, which wasn't my original idea, but anyway, of looking at Polish history, especially since 1945, I'd be happy to take a question. So.
Yeah, Harry, it looks like you have a question.
Has there been any effort on the part of the Polish government to rehabilitate Jewish cemeteries?
You know, I don't know to what degree it's the federal government, but certainly city governments have put money into that, like in Warsaw, for example. But there are also what you think of as non-governmental organizations who are very active in sort of seeing themselves as allies with the Jewish community who are involved in that in both Poland, but also in Ukraine as well. I know actually a little bit more about that in Ukraine than in Poland. And of course, the community in Poland is too small to take care of that, right, themselves. So there are many cemeteries that no one is taking care of. There are some that have been sort of dramatically revived and cleaned up by local populations that have come to embrace that past. It just depends. It just depends on the locality.
Charles, it looks like your virtual hand is raised. You're welcome to speak.
I can't hear you, Charles.
Yeah, it looks like your audio is not working. Maybe, Charles, if you try typing your question in the chat box, I can read it out.
Maybe now it's working. Is it okay?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Charles, we can hear you, and Blima, we can hear you. Maybe you could go after Charles.
Okay.
Charles, go for it.
So my question is whether there are vandalism or attacks on any of the modern Jewish institutions. And I know in some places, Israel provides security forces for, bodyguards and things for the synagogues. Do you know if any of that is part of the scene?
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast because, I mean, I can show you public surveys that have large percentages of the Polish population holding what we certainly would say are anti-Semitic views. At the same time, no matter what one says about this right-wing and xenophobic, anti-gay, anti-Jewish, less vocally, but still a governing coalition, there is very little violence or attacks on the Jewish population compared. It's nothing like, there's no parallel to some of the things you've heard about France, some incidents, nothing like that has taken place in Poland. That doesn't mean there might not have been some vandalism or some, writing on cemeteries. I'd assume that happens, but they don't. The Jewish community institutions in Poland don't have those bodyguards, right? Whereas they do in Vienna, which I know more in terms of my own research, is that. There they do have guards. They've had them since the 80s, for example. And I know in France, they've increased that kind of security. Maybe they've done some of that at like the school in Warsaw I showed you the picture of, but generally speaking, that has not been the case. If it has been, it would only be the last couple of years.
Lima, do you want to ask your question next?
Sure. I left Poland in 1969. I grew up in Poland that was previously a German lands in East Silesia. My father was from the West Poland, but when he came back from Russia, he was not allowed to to enter his house. So most Jews at that time who came back from Russia immigrated to or settled in a western part of Poland. I was called a dirty Jew every day of my life up to high school. The reason my parents couldn't leave Poland because I lived in a small town and a local police would not allow us to leave, would not sign the papers. We left in '69. I went back to Poland, maybe 5-6 years ago. I went to my hometown, not much has changed. I went to Krakow, it's beautiful. My question is, who paid for, reviving of the synagogues and stuff? Was it EU, was it Israel or Jewish community, or was it Polish government? Also, your map of concentration labor camps lacks a lot of other smaller camps. I grew up 3 kilometers from Gross Rosen, which was also, one of the camps, mostly labor.
Okay, so thank you for that comment and for your personal history. I appreciate that. I was lucky enough to have taken, when I was learning Polish at Columbia, my teacher was a Polish poet who left in 1968, Anna Freilich-Zając. I don't know if you know this name, but and she vowed never to return until communism was over, and she only returned in the last few years and was received very graciously, actually, as opposed to when she left, like when your family left. Yeah, so in terms of the first part, who pays for that? It's just a combination of things. Like some of these foundations, like the Lauder Foundation and others, were really the spearheads early on. Some of it has been in partnership with local governments or even the federal government in Poland. The example of that is the Poland Museum, which was paid, I think, 1/3 by the city of Warsaw, 1/3 by the federal government of Poland, and then 1/3 by foreign donations. Yeah, so it's a combination of things. And when you go to some of these places that have been fixed up, you'll often see a plaque on the front, and it'll sort of list all these kind of international institutions and also local agencies. So it's really a combination of things. There's no one answer to that. Yeah, as opposed to camps, this is a whole different subject. It's absolutely true. There were, they now say that there were about 40,000 different kinds of camps that the Nazis had. They were labor camps and POW camps, and there were the large concentration camps that each had up to several sub camps to them. But most scholars would say, as I do, that there were only 6 extermination camps. So I only showed the picture of the 6 extermination camps, not of all camps. It's just, so yes, you're right, of course. And those places were, many of them, thousands of them, were places of torture and death and starvation and horror. They're just, as a scholar, maybe we spend too much time on this differentiation of categories, right? And there is something different, though, especially about Sobibor, Belzec, and Treblinka, than about any of the others. Maybe Chelmno, let's put those 4 together, than about any of the others, right? Because they were constructed only as places for murder, which is different from those other places.
Right.
Dan?
Yes.
I know when you ask about who's fixing up cemeteries and things like that, I went to Poland with my father, I don't know, about 15 to more than 20 years ago, before he died. And his organization, they came from a town in Lublin County, and his organization, it was Mizrich. I don't know if you ever heard of that. I can't even pronounce what it was in Polish, Mizrich Podlaski. But that's it, Mizrich Podlaski. They paid to redo the cemetery, and what they did was, when they took all the desecrated headstones, they did a wall of all the headstones around it, and cleaned it up. And like Blima, I was born on the western part that used to be Germany.
So was I.
You know, yeah, in a town called Jerzhonyev.
Jerzhonyev, that was 20 kilometers from where I come from.
Yeah,
And
so but he was lucky. My parents were lucky enough. We all left in '48 to Sweden, so we lucked out.
Interesting.
But I'm sorry.
My father comes from 25 kilometers from Mendzhizhets.
Oh, does he?
And his family in '42 was taken to Mendzhizhets ghetto.
Yeah, my father was lucky in �39. He left for Russia and wound up during the war in Siberia. But my mother spent time in Auschwitz.
I mean, one of the ironies, of course, is that when Germany and the Soviet Union split Poland in half, and eventually the Soviets will take hundreds of thousands of civilians and put them into the interior of the Soviet Union. Many people fled to the west side because they didn't want to be taken deep into the Soviet Union.
Right.
Of course, those are the vast majority of Jews who survive are those who went into the Soviet Union, and then they come back in 1944-45 behind the Soviet forces into 46. And as Ms. Ritterstein said, many of them will settle in the West, but the Western part, but most of them will leave after Kielce, after the de-Stalinization, certainly after 1968.
Absolutely.
I was told when, like my dad came back from Russia to his town, he told me the Poles were just as bad as the Germans.
Absolutely.
Well, this you know, that's a huge question, and I only referred to it some, and it's a current issue. It never seems to be anything but the current issue in Polish public conversation, which is, you know, do we spend more time talking about Irena Sendler, one of the heroes, right, who saves thousands of children from the Warsaw Ghetto, or do we, at a peril of her own life? Or do we talk more about people who made other kinds of negative decisions? And
I guess you have both kinds everywhere.
Right. And so I try not to say all and so on, but certainly that, you know, I certainly don't deny that. And that was this issue in court that just happened 2 weeks ago. It's a detail in 2,000 pages of really a damning look at Polish individual behavior during World War II. There's just about 20 lines that refer to a specific incident, and it had to do with a local mayor who housed this Jewish woman. And after the war, she testified on his behalf because he was accused of turning in or helping to tell the Germans about a group of Jews hiding in the nearby forest, and something like 20 of them end up being murdered by the Nazis because of that. So after the war, he's up for trial in the Polish court system, and she testifies on his behalf and said he saved her and he didn't kill anybody or, you know, contribute to. So then later she's out of Poland. I don't know if she left in '68 or when she left, but in 1996, as part of the Shoah Foundation testimonies, she laid out her story, and she said in there that she lied in court in 1950, fearing a retribution. And this guy stole all her money. Yes, he saved her, but he also stole all her money for it. And he told the Germans about those people in the forest. So the historians took her 1996 testimony. Do you see that? And they said, you know, he demanded her money and he turned in those people. And the Polish court, he was sued, the editors of the book were sued by the niece of this local mayor, who's 82 or something like that today. And the court said he was innocent in 1950, so you have to discount 1996 survivor testimony. And if you don't, you are smearing the memory of an innocent man. right? So that was the court's decision. Now they're appealing that, the historians, right? Because who is a court to say to a historian that you should bring more weight on this evidence than this evidence? Do you see that? It's odd to make that a court decision. But anyway, that's the latest on this, and it's a huge to-do in Poland again, giving rise to some really ugly language about Jews. You know, and we have this here, right? Does anybody read online newspapers and then you look at the comments by people below, and it's kind of shocking, and you hope that's not what most readers think, right? But that kind of thing in Poland, because you know, about these stories are just full of things that look like the material I read for my work on anti-Jewish violence in 1900, right? And it's really shocking.
The young generation, I think, has no history with all this, so they're a little bit different. Look at it, our young generation as well, you know, less anti-Semitic, less racist and whatever, but it's very difficult. It's a difficult subject, and it will never be solved, but because there were good and bad people, as you know, I hate to say that, but you know, it is what it is. But it's just painful when you think about it, for me at least, growing up there, and my father, what his family went through, it's unforgivable.
So I'll just make two comments about that. I mean, one thing is the political divide in many parts of the world it parallels in some sense our own. And if yes. You look at Poland, well, look at the United States. If you look at polling data on opinions, public opinion, right? People in the United States under, I don't know, 45 or whatever number you want to give think gay people are fine and find foreigners great and want to learn from them about their other countries and want to live in urban settings that are full of diversity. And people over 60, I'm not attacking anybody in particular, but the numbers are completely flipped, right, Lima? So and those numbers are also very different in the United States between urban attitudes, urban and now urban suburban versus rural areas, right, on some of these same issues. So in Poland, I would say those divides are, if anything, more extreme. So the mayor of Warsaw is incredibly popular, says gay people are fine. We want to think of Polishness as our multicultural past. We want to embrace that past. And that includes the Jewish past and what remains of the Jewish population. And that's urban Warsaw. In smaller towns and rural areas, he is a betrayer. He must be paid off by the Jews, right? And so on and so on. He says, let's embrace some immigration. In the countryside, they say that pollutes Polish purity, right? So again, those divides are familiar to us here in the United States, but certainly the centrality of the Jewish question is obviously different in Poland than it is here, right? Although you hear it, right?
Sure, they want to be a part of EU, and you know that they have a blemish on their character. So, and they would love to attract the tourism, and you know, so it looks good when there is a big museum in the middle of Warsaw, but you know where it was supposed to be, well, on top of the graves. But
so along these lines, just to show the connection, the government today that in the president who wins in 2015, the head of that party, really the power of that party, is Jarosław Kaczynski. And he, of course, every chance he gets, he says George Soros is paying to bring foreign immigrants into our country, to bring brown people, to dilute our whiteness, to bring Muslims, to undermine our Christianity, to bring, and so on, right? It sounds like it's written by some political figures in the United States, yeah? So this, and Soros, of course, you all know, is the new bugaboo of the right around the world, and stands in as the Jewish octopus who's somehow controlling everything.
Right.
Right. So,
Like the lasers.
Sorry?
Like the lasers in California.
So that's right, like the Rothschild laser.
Right.
In Poland and Hungary even more so, it would be, of course, the Soros lasers. You wouldn't hear the Rothschilds quite as much. The Rothschild seems like quite a throwback, I would say.
Yes.
Anyway, happy to answer any other questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, we probably have time for one more question if anyone has it. I know there's a question in the chat that I can also ask too if no one wants to jump in. The question from the chat is that considering the drastic changing to the Polish border over the last century or so, is there still a sense of community or togetherness among the Eastern European nations like Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, etc.?
I was so optimistic after 1989 about the direction Poland might go and Eastern Europe. I become less optimistic, but there's still some signs. Like some years back, I don't remember when it was. There was soccer is such a big thing in Europe, and actually Poland and Ukraine together hosted the World Cup, which is amazing, right? Considering post 1918 struggles and murders during World War II by Ukrainian nationalists against Poles, Polish nationalists against Ukrainians in the middle of World War II, that they would host that together is certainly something that seemed so positive. But when I'm talking about Pilsudski versus Dmowski, that doesn't mean non-Poles thought of Pilsudski really, or today think of him as only good, right? Because of course his vision of a bigger Poland still meant the Poles would be leading that federation of peoples, right? I mean, he's not Dmowski, but there are limits to what his imagination was, and so those Eastern European peoples don't have nostalgia that they want to become part of Poland, Lithuania. Do you see? They to the degree they look west, they want to have ties to the EU for economic reasons, and they want to have safety from the Russian bear. But that's, I don't know if that's an answer, but that's the best I can do.
Thank you. Well, I think the sign of any fruitful and engaging conversation is that it's not over when the time is up. So I encourage everyone to continue to reach out to Professor Unowsky and continue these conversations. There was a request in the chat for you to lead a tour group to Poland one day post-COVID. So please let us know.
Well, I have done that.
You have a whole group.
As Carol Buckman knows, I have done that. I did it a couple of times with Jonathan Judakin at Rhodes and Steve Haynes at Rhodes. The three of us have done it a couple of times. And I don't know if we'll do it again in the near future, but it's not impossible. So.
Well, it's something we'll keep on our wish list for after COVID. So thank you everyone for signing on today. I'll give a quick plug about our next lecture, which is in 2 weeks on Friday, March 5th at the same time from 12 to 1 right here on Zoom with Professor Beverly Sakionis. I think I said that right. Who's also a professor of history at University of Memphis, and she'll be speaking on healing and conflict in Syria and Lebanon. So I'll email the link to that to everyone in case you're interested in signing on. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a safe and healthy weekend and gets through the snow and water crisis safely. And again, thank you for speaking with us today, Professor Unowsky. It's always a pleasure to work with you.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Sophie. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.